It happened on what should have been a quiet Sunday morning, the kind where sunlight slips gently through the kitchen blinds, and the smell of fresh coffee fills the air. I'd woken up early like I always do, careful not to make a sound. My knees ached with every step, but I'd grown used to that over time. At 72, with a hip that's been through surgery, pain just becomes part of you. I made my way to the kitchen and set the table, the same way I used to when my husband Frank was still alive. Then I sat and waited. My daughter Rachel was the first to come down, wrapped in her robe and glued to her phone. She barely mumbled a hello when I said good morning. A few minutes later the kids came in, Emma 10 and Jake 7, both smiling, sweet as ever, and they took their usual seats. And then he walked in. My son-in-law Brian, tall, broad-shouldered, with a face so hard it looked carved from stone. He didn't say a word. Just poured himself some coffee, grabbed the plate of eggs Rachel had made, and dropped down heavily at the head of the table. I sat at the end, far from everyone now, with a slice of toast and a little scrambled egg on my plate. I never wanted to be a bother, never asked for more. I smiled the way I always tried to. "Morning, Brian," I said softly. He didn't answer, just kept chewing, loud and forceful. The room thickened with silence. Rachel kept her eyes on her phone. The kids whispered about some video game. I was reaching for my tea, trying not to spill, when Brian suddenly shoved his chair back with a loud scrape. "You know what? I'm done with this," he snapped. We all froze. He turned to me, face flushed with anger. "You eat, but you don't help. You sit there like you're queen of this place. But you're not. You're just freeloading." Rachel's head shot up. Emma dropped her spoon. Jake shrank in his seat. I stared at him, stunned. "I'm trying, Brian. My hip's still healing," the doctor said. But he just let out this cold, hollow laugh. "Your hip? You've been here 6 months, just taking up space. Using our water, our lights, eating our food." "Brian, not now," Rachel whispered, her eyes wide, pleading. But he wasn't done. He grabbed his mug, still steaming, and in one fast, awful moment flung the coffee at me. The hot liquid splashed across my lap, soaking my old blue nightgown, burning my skin. I gasped, not from the pain but from the sheer shock. The mug hit the floor and rolled under the counter. I stared at the brown stain spreading through the fabric, my hands trembling. The kids sat frozen, their mouths open. And then, to make it worse, Brian slammed his plate down so hard the eggs bounced and the plate cracked. "I work 50 hours a week and come home to this," he shouted. A house full of people lounging around, eating on my dime. I couldn't move. The heat on my thigh throbbed, but I sat there, paralyzed. Rachel just stared at her plate, lips pressed tight. Then Brian looked straight at me and said, low and bitter, "You're not my mother. And you sure as hell don't get to live here like some damn freeloader." The words hit like a punch. They echoed inside me, sharp and cruel. I looked to Rachel, hoping she'd say something. Anything. Hoping she'd remember who I was, her mother. The woman who raised her, nursed her through every fever, saved every handmade card. This house used to belong to me and Frank. But all she did was whisper, "Brian. Not now. Just not now." And that silence, it rang louder than a scream. Emma slowly handed me a napkin. I took it with shaking hands and tried wiping at the wet fabric, swallowing back the shame and disbelief burning in my throat. "I think I'll go upstairs," I said, barely louder than a breath. No one stopped me. I climbed the stairs slowly, gripping the railing, every step heavier than the last. It wasn't the burn that hurt the most. It was the realization that I didn't belong here anymore. That the home I helped build, the family I'd poured everything into, had no space left for me. At the top of the stairs I paused. Brian was already back on his phone. Rachel was gathering plates. The kids were staring into their cereal like it might tell them what to feel. And in that moment I knew. I wasn't a mother in this house. Not a grandmother. Not even a person. Just a shadow in a chair nobody wanted filled. I reached my room like a ghost. My legs still wet, the gown clinging to my skin. The hallway felt colder than usual, though I knew it was just the shock. I closed my door quietly, careful not to make it creak. Then I locked it, not out of fear, but because, at that moment, it was the only thing I could still control. I sat on the edge of the bed, my hands shaking in my lap. The thin floral blanket I used every night was still halfway folded, just the way I left it. Beneath my pillow, George's old handkerchief was tucked carefully, like always. I couldn't stop staring at the brown stains on my legs and nightgown, watching them spread like bruises that had bloomed right through the fabric. With stiff fingers, I reached up and slowly unbuttoned the collar. I changed clothes without really thinking, just went through the motions, and slipped into one of the few housecoats I had left that wasn't worn thin. Then I sat back down and listened. Nothing. No footsteps in the hallway, no knock on the door, no quiet apology from behind the wood. Just silence. They had already gone on with their morning like nothing had happened. That silence pressed in on me like a weight. I touched my chest and felt something familiar beneath the fabric. My fingers closed around the tiny gold locket I still wore every single day, even now, even after they made fun of me for being so sentimental. I clicked it open gently. Inside, the small black and white photo of George stared back at me. His eyes serious, jaw tight, the way he looked the day he came home from the war. And just like that, I was no longer in that room. I was back in the spring air, surrounded by sawdust and the smell of cedar. George was outside, sweat dripping from his brow, hammer in hand. He'd spent months building that front porch himself. Every board, every nail he placed with care. He didn't have to, could have hired someone, but that wasn't George. After the war, he told me all he wanted was to make something with his own hands, something steady, something peaceful. "This house will keep you safe when I'm gone," he said one evening, holding my face with those rough, calloused palms. "That's why I'm building it with my own 2 fists." We moved in during the spring of 1959. Back then, it was just an open patch of land in rural Kentucky. No neighbors yet, only wide fields and birds that sang like they were welcoming us home. Trees swayed in the wind like they already knew who we were. Deer wandered up near the fence out back. George painted the kitchen blue. He said it reminded him of my eyes. I remember baking our first meal there with flour still dusted up to my elbows from the cornbread. We laughed like kids, danced across the living room to an old scratchy song on the radio, even before the floors were finished. That house held us through everything. 3 children. 1 miscarriage. Summers that burned and winters where we kept warm by stacking quilts high and sitting in silence together. The night our youngest, Rachel, was born, George must have broken every traffic rule in Mason County just to get me to the hospital in time. And when he cradled her in his arms, it was like every hard edge he brought home from the war melted into something soft. He was never perfect, but he loved us with a kind of loyalty that never once faltered. Even near the end, when cancer had drained nearly all his strength, he still made me wheel him out onto the porch every morning just so he could watch the sunrise. That porch he built, the land he worked, that house he always called ours. 2 days before he passed, he looked at me clear-eyed and spoke words I've never forgotten. "If they love you, they'll respect this house. They'll understand what it means. And if they don't, June, don't sign a damn thing. This house was built with love. Don't let them turn it into something ugly." He held my gaze, steady and full of warning. "Promise me." And I did. I meant it with all my heart. I clutched that locket tight, the metal warm from my skin. I had kept that promise. When Rachel and Brian brought the papers, right after the funeral, I smiled and told them I needed time to think. They brought them back again 2 more times. Each time I said the same thing. Rachel had that familiar look of guilt in her eyes, and Brian, as usual, carried nothing but irritation in his. But I never did sign those papers. I kept them hidden deep in the bottom drawer of Frank's old desk, right here in this very room, tucked beneath the folded service flag from his army days and the small wooden box that held our wedding bands. I knew what they probably thought, that eventually I caved, that because Rachel was our daughter she had just inherited the house automatically like I had no reason to hold on. But they were wrong. I still had the deed. I still had the power. And after what happened that morning, after Brian's cruel words and that steaming coffee, I finally saw what Frank must have always known. Sometimes love isn't just about remembering what was, but about protecting what still is, and what still could be. I stood up slowly, walked over to the desk, opened the drawer and pulled out the folder. Dust had gathered on it, but I knew its weight like I knew the sound of Frank's voice. The transfer papers were still in there, untouched. And underneath them the original deed with my name printed in clear black ink. I sat down again, holding it all in my lap, staring at that empty signature line. It was blank. Waiting. Powerful. And right then I didn't feel invisible anymore. I felt alive. For the first time in months I remembered who I was. And maybe, just maybe, it was time they remembered too. At dinner that night I stayed quiet like I'd learned to do. My plate, as always, held what was left after everyone else had taken their share. Rachel placed it in front of me without a glance, like she was handing me a napkin, not a meal. The kids chatted about their day, Emma giggling, Jake excited about some project at school. Brian chewed with his mouth open, eyes locked on his phone, and the TV hummed something meaningless in the background. No one asked if I was okay. No one asked about the burn on my leg. It still hurt, red and sore. But over time I'd learned that physical pain was nothing compared to being erased emotionally. I buttered a slice of bread slowly, as if drawing out the only task I had left to do. No one noticed. I was just a shadow in the corner, a curtain no one bothered to open anymore. Sometimes Emma would smile and Jake would say, "Night-night, Grandma," if he remembered. But they were still kids, still innocent, not yet taught how to pretend someone doesn't exist. Rachel glanced at me once, gave that tight, unreadable half-smile she always did when she didn't want to feel anything too deeply. Later, after dinner, while I stood at the sink rinsing my plate under warm water, Rachel came up behind me. "Mom," she said softly, "please don't take what Brian said this morning to heart. He's been under a lot of stress at work." I turned off the tap. I didn't say anything. She rushed ahead like she wanted to get through it fast. "He's not a bad guy. He just loses his temper sometimes. He doesn't mean it." I turned to face her. Her eyes dropped to the floor. "He threw hot coffee on me, Rachel," I said quietly. "Right in front of your kids." She bit her lip. "I know. I really need you not to make things harder right now. Please." I gave her a single nod, then turned back and finished washing the plate. Harder. That's what I was to her. Not a mother. Not a woman. Just another thing that made her life more difficult. That night I sat on my bed with one of the few things that still felt like mine. A notepad and a pen. I didn't write out of anger. I wrote because I needed to. I began listing things. Words. Dates. The little things he said, the way he looked at me. January 18th. "You just eat and watch TV. At least the dog fetches." February 5th. He shoved my pill box into the drawer, said, "Keep your meds out of my kitchen." March 12th. He rolled his eyes at my sweater draped on a chair and muttered, "You hanging laundry in my dining room now?" It became my small ritual, quiet, private. I hid the notebook under my pillow every morning. Writing gave me back something. My memory, my clarity, my truth. They may have erased me during the day, but at night I wrote myself back into existence. I began watching Brian closer. The way he stomped through the house like it owed him gratitude. The way Rachel flinched when he raised his voice, even if it wasn't at her. The way he threw his boots in the hallway like the floor was lucky to have them. The more distant Rachel became, the more I felt her slipping away, not just from me but from who she used to be. My daughter had once been full of fire and laughter, a girl who questioned everything. Now she moved like someone afraid of cracking open. I wanted to ask her where that spark went, but I already knew. It had been smothered bit by bit under the weight of trying to keep the peace. And that peace had cost too much. One night I was walking down the hallway when I heard Brian's voice coming from the garage. He was on the phone. I stopped near the cracked door out of sight. "Nah man," he said laughing. "I swear to God it's like living with a ghost. The old lady just floats around, eats my food, says thank you like she's royalty, doesn't lift a damn finger, always going on about her hip. I'd rather clean a dog kennel than live with a mother-in-law who thinks the world owes her." Laughter on the other end. Brian laughed too. And I just stood there. My heart didn't stop, but it slowed. It was a strange, hollow feeling. Somewhere between heartbreak and the quiet acceptance that comes when you finally stop expecting more. I walked back to my room without making a sound. That night I didn't write a single word in my notebook. I just lay there staring at the ceiling, watching how the shadows danced from the street lamp outside. I kept hearing that sentence again and again in my mind. I'd rather clean a dog kennel. That's how he saw me. Less than a person. Less than even an animal. I remembered something Frank once told me from his days in the military. He said the worst insults weren't shouted in anger. They were whispered behind someone's back. It wasn't how loud they were that hurt. It was knowing someone believed them, and thought no one else would care. Brian believed what he said. And he assumed I wouldn't care. But I did. More than he'd ever know. Not because his words shocked me, but because they confirmed something I'd been quietly fearing for a long time. I was no longer June. Not June who hosted Thanksgiving dinners for 30 in this house. Not June who stayed up late sewing Rachel's prom dress when we couldn't afford one from the store. Not June, who cried with joy holding her newborn grandchild in the very living room they now ignored me in. I had become background noise, a prop in a story that forgot I once had a name. That's when I started to see the house differently. Not as a home anymore, but as a battlefield where memory had to fight to survive. And I knew deep in my bones that if I died tomorrow, they wouldn't remember me as the woman who built a life here. They'd remember me as the quiet old lady who sat in the corner. And I wasn't going to let that be the ending of my story. The next morning, before anyone else had stirred, I unlocked the bottom drawer of Frank's old writing desk. The air felt heavy still, the kind of silence that makes the skin feel tight. I knelt down, my hip complaining the whole time, and reached into the back of the drawer, pulling out a faded leather folder Frank had kept locked up for years. My fingers moved over its surface like I was holding something sacred. And I opened it slowly, almost like a prayer. Inside were the original documents, still crisp, a little yellowed around the edges. The deed to the house. The transfer agreement Frank had worked out with our lawyer nearly 10 years ago. I remembered that day clearly, even though I hadn't understood most of the legal talk. It had been a calm afternoon in our kitchen. Frank sat across from our attorney, Mr. Harold Whitaker, with a pen in hand, that same focused look on his face he always had when fixing something important. "I want the house to go to Rachel one day," he'd said. "But not automatically. Not unless June says so. This place was built for her. And if anyone ever treats her like she's not family, I want her to have the right to say, 'This is mine. And you don't belong here.'" He looked at me then, not with sentiment but with certainty. Like he already knew someday I'd need that kind of power. Mr. Whitaker nodded and drafted the clause. Rachel would inherit the house in name only, but full ownership would require one final signature. And that line, after all these years, still sat there empty. Waiting. I stared at it again, now with the weight of everything that had happened. That signature was the only thing standing between me and freedom. I held the papers tightly, slid them into a plain manila envelope, and pulled on my coat. It was 7:15 a.m. The house was quiet. Brian never got up before 8 on weekends. Rachel usually slept in even longer. I had time. I took the local bus into town and sat by the window, clutching the envelope to my chest like it could shield me from the world outside. Nothing much had changed in Mason. The streets still curved the same way, the old coffee shop still sat on the corner, and the courthouse's white paint was still flaking like always. Mr. Harold Whitaker's office was still above the bakery on Magnolia Street, the one that always smelled like cinnamon and sugar. I buzzed the doorbell and waited. He opened it with a surprised expression that quickly softened into a smile. "Well, June Harper," he said warmly. "My God, it's been too long." I nodded, my voice trembling just a bit. "I need to talk to you. About the house." He gestured me inside, and soon we were sitting across from each other at the same old desk, like nothing had changed but time. I laid the envelope in front of him and slid out the papers. "I never signed it," I said quietly. "But now, I think I might be ready." He adjusted his glasses and looked through the documents, nodding. "You absolutely have the right," he said. "Frank set this up exactly how he said he would. It's all right here. You're the final authority." His words landed like bricks, quiet but solid. I leaned back and let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding for months. "And if I want to sell it?" I asked. "Sell it, gift it, lease it, burn it down," he said, half smiling. "It's legally yours." The thought made me chuckle just barely. Burn it down. The image was almost comforting. He looked at me a moment, his tone softer. "Are you thinking of leaving?" "I'm thinking of surviving," I told him. He nodded slowly, the look in his eyes said he understood more than he let on. We talked a while longer, about what the next steps would be. He promised to help handle everything quietly, just the way I asked. And that, I told him, was exactly what I needed. Quiet but final. When I stepped out of Mr. Whitaker's office, the sky had already brightened and I felt lighter. Not just in body but in spirit, like something in the air had shifted, letting me breathe deeper than I had in months. I walked slowly through the quiet streets of downtown Mason, past old brick storefronts and neat rows of flower beds, past children holding their parents' hands. And then I stopped, almost without thinking, in front of the bulletin board outside the post office. It was cluttered with the usual flyers: guitar lessons, bake sales, lost cats. But one flyer stood out. Bold green letters read, Calling landowners. Local conservation trust seeking rural properties to preserve natural heritage. Let your land become a legacy. A phone number sat at the bottom in thick black print. I read it once. Then again. And again. And with each pass something settled inside me. An idea, quiet but firm. I thought about the land behind the house. The acres George once cleared with nothing but a shovel and determination. The trees that still bore the memory of his hands. The wildflower field where Rachel used to run barefoot in the spring. I heard his voice echo in my head. This place is peace. I want it to stay peaceful long after we're gone. Maybe it still could. I pulled the flyer from the board, folded it neatly and tucked it into my coat pocket. When I got home, I didn't stop in the kitchen or check if anyone had returned. I went straight to my room, opened the bottom drawer of Frank's old filing cabinet, and pulled out the local survey map. I spread it over the bed, smoothed out the edges and traced the boundary lines with my finger. 22 acres. Untouched. Still zoned private residential. Just the kind of land a conservation trust might be searching for. I leaned back and let the weight of it all settle, like the first cool breeze after a stifling summer. If I sold this land, not to Rachel, not to Brian, not to any neighbor looking to build, but to someone who'd protect it, preserve it, keep it out of their reach forever. That would be the kind of justice Frank would have wanted. The kind of quiet revenge I'd never allowed myself to consider, until now. I folded the map, placed it beside the flyer, and sat alone in the quiet of my room, listening to the faint sounds of life drifting up from downstairs. Brian's laughter, Rachel calling the kids to pick up their mess. They thought I was just a ghost in this house. But the light was about to change. And when it did, they'd finally see me, clearly. I waited until late Monday morning when I knew the house would be empty. Brian had left early, grumbling about traffic like he always did, and Rachel was out driving the kids between piano and karate lessons. The only sound in the house was the steady tick of the kitchen clock and the low hum of the refrigerator. I sat down at Frank's desk, the flyer beside me, and dialed the number at the bottom. The phone rang twice. "Thank you for calling the Kentucky Land and Conservation Trust. How can I help you today?" A cheerful voice answered. I cleared my throat. "Yes, good morning. I saw your flyer downtown about the land opportunity." "Yes, ma'am. We're currently reviewing several properties for our nature reserve project. May I ask your name?" I hesitated. "Actually, I'd prefer not to share that over the phone just yet. I'm in a delicate situation." There was a pause, then warmth returned to her voice. "Of course, ma'am. We respect confidentiality. Would you like to schedule a discreet assessment?" "Yes," I said. "I'd like someone to come take a look. Quietly. I don't want anyone in the household to know." "Understood. We've done private evaluations before. May I have the address?" I gave it slowly, clearly. By the time I hung up, my heart was racing. They scheduled a private visit for Thursday at 2:30 p.m. After I placed the phone back in the drawer, I felt a strange calm settle in. A stillness like the kind before a summer storm rolls in. On Thursday afternoon, right on time, a beige SUV pulled into the gravel edge of the property. Two people stepped out. A woman in her 30s wearing a green utility vest with the Trust's logo, and a man with a clipboard in hand. I met them by the back gate, dressed in old gardening gloves and a sun hat, purposefully plain. And with a gentle southern drawl I hadn't used in years, I greeted them. "Y'all from the Trust?" The woman smiled warmly. "We are. We're here to evaluate the land." "Well, the folks ain't home," I said, tipping my hat toward the house. "I'm just the caretaker. Been looking after this place since the old man passed. So we'll need to keep things quiet." They exchanged a look, then nodded. I led them around the property, pointing out the old boundaries, the tree line, and the small creek that still trickled quietly through the southern edge. They took photographs, made notes, whispered to one another. They asked about wildlife, zoning, soil, water flow. I answered every question with quiet certainty. I'd lived on this land more than 40 years. I knew it better than I knew my own reflection. Before they left, the woman turned to me. "We'd be very interested. If you're the decision maker, we'd like to send over an offer and some draft paperwork." I nodded slowly. "I am. And yes. Please do." That night I didn't sleep, not from fear but from adrenaline. The next morning the email came. The offer was generous. More than generous. Enough to walk away. Enough to start again. Enough to make sure Brian and Rachel never set foot on this land again. I printed the documents, sat down with a clear head and a steady hand, and signed the intent to transfer. It was a quiet kind of victory, the kind that doesn't shout but hums in your chest. Still, my fingers trembled just a little as I sealed the envelope. I wrote the date for notarization at the top, slid it into the drawer next to the original deed and closed it slowly. All that was left now was the courthouse signature. That evening, as the sun dropped behind the trees and gold spilled across the living room floor, I stood in my bedroom folding clothes. One at a time, slowly and neatly, I packed a small suitcase. Not everything, just what mattered. My nightgown, my gold locket, the notebook, a framed photo of Frank, the leather folder, my worn Bible, 2 scarves, arthritis cream, and a little jar of peppermint candies. It felt peaceful, almost like preparing for a long-awaited trip. Then I heard laughter from downstairs. I paused and peeked through the thin crack in my door. There they were, Brian with his feet up on the coffee table, one arm around Rachel, both of them chuckling at some sitcom. Just like that, like nothing had happened. Like the insults, the silence, the scalding coffee had all evaporated into thin air. Rachel leaned her head on his shoulder. He kissed the top of her hair, smiling. Their happiness buzzed in my ears like static. And I said nothing. I just shut the door and zipped the suitcase closed. That moment stayed with me longer than I expected. Not because it made me sad, but because it made me certain. They thought I was upstairs, out of sight and out of mind. But I was already downstairs in my thoughts, unzipping my way toward a future where they no longer had power over me. The next morning, while the sky was still dark, I slipped out the front door. Stars were beginning to fade and the chill in the air caught in my throat like hope. I moved quietly, careful not to let the hinges creak, clutching my purse tight with both hands. Inside it was everything. The notarized paperwork, the original deed, my ID, and a worn envelope holding the last letter Frank ever wrote me for strength. Behind me the house slept. No footsteps. No laughter. No tension. Just the hum of the fridge and the occasional sigh of settling floorboards. I paused at the curb and inhaled the cold Kentucky air. It tasted like freedom. Right on time, a yellow taxi rolled up. The driver, a young man with soft music playing on the radio, loaded my little suitcase into the trunk without a single question. I was grateful for that. Downtown, I said. Courthouse first. Then one more stop. We drove in silence. When we reached the county clerk's office, I walked in with steady hands and handed over the entire envelope. The woman behind the counter reviewed the documents, nodded and smiled. Everything looks perfect, Ms. Harper. The Conservation Trust wired the funds early this morning. The transfer is complete. Just like that. So fast. So final. I asked for a copy of the completed transaction for my records. As she printed it, she glanced up and said, "You know, we don't see land donated like this too often. You're preserving something really meaningful." I smiled. That's the idea. From there, the cab took me across town to visit a woman I hadn't seen in years, Margie Blackwell. Another widow like me. Sharp-tongued, warm-hearted, and the proud owner of a porch full of wind chimes. We'd fallen out of touch after Frank died, mostly my fault. But when I called her last week and asked if I could stay a few nights, she didn't hesitate. "Of course, June," she'd said. "I've got a warm bed and fresh pie. You just bring your stories." She didn't ask why I was leaving. She just opened the door and wrapped me in a hug. That afternoon, I received the final confirmation email. The land transfer had gone through. The house and all 22 acres were now officially part of the Kentucky Reserve Project, effective immediately. I spent the next day on Margie's porch, wrapped in a quilt, watching squirrels chase each other across her fence line. My heart didn't carry bitterness, just stillness. The kind that comes after you walk out of a storm and realize you're still standing. But back at the house, my former house, things were no longer still. At precisely 10:07 a.m. the next morning, Brian opened the front door to find 2 uniformed county officers and a representative from the Conservation Trust standing on the porch. "Is this the residence of Brian and Rachel Sanders?" one of the officers asked. Brian blinked. "Yeah." The officer continued. "We're here to inform you that the property you're occupying has been legally transferred. You're now considered tenants without legal contract or right of residence. This is your 48-hour notice to vacate." Brian laughed in disbelief. "What the hell are you talking about? My wife owns this house." The representative handed him a folder. She doesn't. Never did. The property was never signed over. Miss June Harper retained full authority. She's executed a legal sale. The house now belongs to the Kentucky Land and Conservation Trust. Rachel stepped into the doorway barefoot, her eyes wide with panic. She grabbed the folder from his hands. No. This has to be a mistake. My mom lives here. This is our home, our children's home. The officer remained calm. Ma'am, if you believe your rights have been violated, you're welcome to pursue the matter in court. But I assure you the transaction is legal and final. You have 48 hours to vacate the premises or face legal removal. That's what the officer said. And then all hell broke loose. Rachel cried out, desperate to see me. Brian cursed loud enough that the neighbor across the street came out onto their porch, trying to figure out what was going on. Emma and Jake stood behind their mother, frozen, arms clinging around each other. Then came the moment I had been preparing for. I arrived 15 minutes later, walking slowly up the gravel path in my plain navy coat, the legal agreement folded in my hand like a flag being presented. The officer turned and nodded. Miss Harper. I gave a small nod back. Rachel spotted me first. Mom, she shouted, running toward me, tears streaking down her cheeks. Why would you do this? What about the kids? This is their home. She was pleading. I looked her in the eyes and said nothing, just long enough for her to feel the silence I had lived with for months. Then I spoke calm and even. You said I took up space. Brian stormed forward, fists tight, face red. You had no right. This was my home too. I stood taller than I had in years. Your home. I repeated. You threw scalding coffee at me like I was trash. You laughed about me behind my back. You lived in my house and treated me like I was some mutt from the street. He started to speak, but I lifted my hand to stop him. You all said I didn't belong. That I was just in the way. But I wasn't in the way, I was the foundation. I stepped closer and held up the deed. I built this house. I built this life. And now I'm building something new. I let that hang for a second, then added, steady and final, I didn't take up space. I was the space. And now, this space is no longer yours. With that, I turned and walked away. The breeze felt light on my back. The weight I had carried for years was finally gone. I never thought I'd be the kind of woman to start a foundation. Honestly, I never thought I'd even leave that house. For so long, I assumed I'd just fade into the wallpaper, pass quietly in my sleep and be remembered only by the creaks in the hallway. But sometimes, it only takes one insult, one broken plate, one cup of coffee flung across a room to wake something up inside you. 2 weeks after the sale was finalized and the land officially transferred to the Kentucky Land and Conservation Trust, I sat across from Mr. Whitaker in his office. Sunlight streamed through the windows as we reviewed the final wire confirmation. Everything's complete, he said, sliding the last page into a folder. So, what's next? I smiled. A little nervous but sure. I want to help people like me. People who've been forgotten in their own homes. Who still matter even if no one at their dinner table sees it anymore. He raised an eyebrow. A non-profit? Exactly, I said. I reached into my purse and pulled out a napkin where I'd scribbled a name. Mob. Make older better. He chuckled. Catchy. And fitting. With his help and a little support from a friend at the local bank, I opened an account and filed the paperwork to make it real. Within a month I had a team, small at first. Some women from my old quilting circle. A retired social worker. And one college intern named Darius, who always called me Miss June like I was royalty. We started simple. Care packages for homebound seniors. Monthly check-in calls. Legal help for folks dealing with family pressure or property abuse. But what people needed most, I learned, wasn't just food or forms. It was a voice. We hosted our first community gathering in the basement of a Unitarian church one Thursday evening. I thought maybe 5 people would show up. 30 came. At the next event, nearly 70. Grandmothers. Veterans. Widows. A quiet man who'd been kicked out of his daughter's home after his stroke. A woman whose family only visited when her check arrived. When I stood to speak, my heart was pounding. But I told them everything. About the coffee, the silence, the burn on my leg, the paper I never signed, and the knock at the door that changed everything. I told them about Frank. About the promise I kept. When I finished, no one clapped right away. It was silent, but not the kind I'd grown used to. The silence was full. Heavy. Sacred. Then someone started clapping. Then another. And soon they were all standing. Some with tears in their eyes. Some just nodding. I had never felt so seen. The next morning a local news station called. Someone had filmed part of my talk and shared it online. They wanted to put me on TV. I hesitated. I'm not sure I want to be some kind of spectacle, I told the young producer. Miss June, she said, you're not a spectacle. You're a signal. The segment aired a week later. They filmed me sitting on Margie's porch, sipping sweet tea while wind chimes danced behind me. Soft piano music played. They cut in photos of my old house with a sign out front. Protected land, future site of Kentucky Natural Preserve. The story spread fast. Before I knew it, I was invited to speak on a podcast. Then at a state summit on elder rights in Nashville. Strangers began sending letters. Some from as far as Maine, others from Oregon. Most of them began the same way. I saw you on the news and cried. I've been living like a ghost too. You reminded me I'm not invisible. A radio host gave me a nickname, the coffee lady who took the land. First I thought it might sting. But it didn't. In fact, I laughed out loud. Because that's exactly who I was. Yes. That's exactly who I was. I was the woman who had hot coffee thrown at her in her own kitchen, and turned that humiliation into something sacred. I was the one they called a burden, a problem too old to matter, and turned that silence into a megaphone. The Mabel Foundation kept growing. We secured a grant to start an emergency housing fund for elders escaping domestic crises. We teamed up with local churches and libraries to host workshops on property law and inheritance rights. We launched a 24-hour hotline. Darius built us a website. Margie ran our Facebook page, posting quotes from our meetings and photos of the cookies we served at every gathering. On the one-year anniversary of the foundation, we held a celebration outside, in the reserve where my house used to stand. The trees swayed in the breeze. The wind was cool, the land peaceful. And under one large oak tree, a small brass plaque had been placed. Read. In honor of June Harper. She took up space and gave it back. A guardian of dignity. I stood before it with tears in my eyes, surrounded by people. Many of them older. Many forgotten by their own families. But they stood tall, hand in hand, smiling. And for just a moment I felt Frank, right there, not just in memory but behind me somehow, leaning close, whispering in my ear, told you not to sign anything. That night, back at Margie's, I looked at myself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. Not because I looked younger, but because I looked alive. Awake. Whole. I smiled, not the tight, polite smile I wore at family dinners. Not the one I used to keep the peace. A real one. White. Unapologetic. It was the first smile in years that felt fully mine. Click subscribe. Turn on the bell. Because truth has no expiration date. And courage is never too late.